Hello, I'm here to talk to you about a very serious issue. History. It keeps happening. We have to put a stop to it. No one is paying any attention to what's going on. I mean, it just suddenly is there, as if it has a mind of its own. And when you try and stop it, when you stop history, it just doesn't. It simply just says, and the history stopped temporarily, and then the next day there's more history. We have to do something about this. This is completely out of control now. I mean, the Egyptians had it, and the Romans had it, and the Renaissance had it, and we've got the war history, and now we've got enough. I mean, how greedy are we that we now need history of like yesterday? No one cares. And in 20 years time, will it be interesting? No, I don't think so. I think the history that was before was much more interesting, so I think we should just stop history. Just stop it altogether. So I've got a petition here which historically has proven to be useful. So we're going to use it now to stop history. Stop history. Stop history. Stop history. Hello, my name is Guy and you're watching the Campaign Creator series where we're talking timelines today. Now, sponsored by World Anvil. We're going to be using World Anvil a little bit later on in terms of creating some awesome timelines. We've done this before, but we didn't do it from the perspective of how can timelines help you to create adventures on the fly, to come up with some curiosities, to basically tie together everything that we've been speaking about over almost the entire year so far. Timelines are going to help us do that in a very fun and creative way. Now, frequently, I find myself going, here's another question, asking about how to avoid writer's block, how to avoid that inevitable, I don't know what to do, I've hit a block. I've hit a point where I can't figure out what's going on. This is yet another way in which you can unlock those creative juices. After all, one of the foundations of imagination is inspiration. Where does inspiration come from? Well, it comes from all sorts of sources, so it makes sense that when you are creating your world, when you are creating your environment, that you have multiple areas from which you can draw inspiration from. And I think timelines are a great one. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the logic of timelines, or at least the logic in terms of a timeline and how the timeline is determined, because creating timelines can be daunting. We're going to look at plotting it out. How can we use this to create interesting plots within our games and stories? And then we're going to look at the fun component of timelines, what they allow us to do, and how we can have some fun with them. So let's just go through these quickly before we go on to the actual World Anvil site. So logic. This happened and it caused that. Rome burnt down and it caused the collapse of the Roman Empire. That's not true in the slightest. There are thousands of things that came together at a specific moment in time which caused the Roman Empire to change and evolve, and it was centuries later that it officially was over. But this happened and that caused that on a smaller scale is much more useful for us because we can see direct links between things. Because England signed a declaration with Brussels protecting them from any European invasion, England was dragged into World War II. It is because of that this happened. There was a direct correlation. At the same time, if they had chosen not to honour that deal, if they had chosen not to fulfil that contract, they would have had a similar problem. We would have had a very different outcome to the war, would we not? Perhaps, perhaps not, we don't know. Timelines would change, they would diverge at that one point. So it's an interesting point to look at as this happened and it caused that. Vacuums of power caused changes too. Once there was no longer any leadership of strength within a specific country, the country changed. Now that there is a new power, that power dominates over everything. If we go to the Egyptians, as far as certain individuals were concerned, the vacuum of power allowed them to take control, and then they erased the timeline beforehand. They said, no, that's silly, we don't want any of that. So vacuums of power, when something happens that shifts where power sits, there is usually going to be a dramatic change of some nature. There's going to be something that will fill that vacuum because that's what we like. And then revenge. Revenge is a wonderful tool that allows us to do certain things. And you're kind of going there, well, wait, what does all of this mean? How do we do that? So let's pop on over to World Anvil. I'm in the timelines section here. We're going to create a new timeline, and we're going to call this one, well, this is Eutherios that we're based in, so let us call it the History of Eutherios. Okay, and a brief description, how Eutherios became the hegemony that it is today. Okay, create timeline. Did I click on the button? I did. I clicked on the button. Great stuff. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at these options and we're going to start including them. So let us add an era to the timeline. No, we don't want to add an era just yet. Let's add an event. Wait, that's the edit of the timeline. Okay, so we can view our timeline. Oh, it's opening it up on that page. There's our timeline. It's very short at the moment. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so here we go. This will be the Battle of Carabrix. And it was at this moment, the Battle of Carabrix, for 200 years. The tribes in the area of Eutherios warred. Okay, and the start date will be year 1, and the end date will be year 201. Okay, so we will create our era. Okay, now we have this setting. So from the start date to the end date, for 200 years, the tribes have been battling. When we go back, let's go back here. This happened and it caused that. So what happened? The Battle of Carabrix. What did it cause? Or more importantly, where was the vacuum of power at the end of the Battle of Carabrix? So that's what we now have to have a look at and understand what then took place. So we go back now here and we say, well, let's see. We are going to add, where am I going now? We're going to create a new historical entry. And that is the death of Gruvicos. And that was, well, that was in 201. All right, that's the time period. Is it of importance? Yes, it is a milestone. It is an era change. What type of event is it? It was the beginning of an era. And so the description of that is, this was the death of Gruvicos. Okay, so Gruvicos was the strongest warlord in the Battle of Carabrix, and his death left a vacuum of power in the region. All the remaining tribes did what? Did what? What did they do? Let's go back here. Did they seek revenge? I don't know. Maybe they did. Revenge upon whom? Revenge upon whom? The slayer of Gruvicos. Because Gruvicos was an honorable leader, even if he was the strongest warlord. So let's go back here. So all the remaining tribes sought revenge. Revenge against the assassin. Well, against the murderer of Gruvicos. A centaur named Hephaneos. All right. Save. Now, the important thing to bear in mind here is that all of these things we're making up on the fly. We are quite literally making them up on the fly. And So that's as simple as it is. And we will now go forward from here. We will now move forward from here when we look at these events and things and say, okay, fantastic. So what now took place? What happened? How and where do we go to in terms of adding in these things? And yeah, basically exploring our timeline. So let's go back. What else are we going to be looking at? So logic is one of them. So this happened, it caused that. This happened, it caused that. Do we need to know where we're going to end up? No, we don't, because we look at plotting. Each event, historical adventure. So this great battle of Carabrix. Is there perhaps a weapon or a shield, or perhaps an undead army that was created for this battle of Carabrix? Perhaps there was a necromancer involved. Perhaps there was a fair maiden who was at the very center of these battles, and she was deeply in love with Gruvix. And the reason why the centaur slew Gruvix was to actually get the maiden. And so Gruvix's spirit is now wandering one of the battlefields, and we can link that in. So there's a historical adventure there. Go and find, go and put to rest, go and restore, all that kind of thing. Who won what? Well, in our Battle of Carabrix, which is one entry in our timeline, and we will expand that timeline further, but in the Battle of Carabrix, when we expand that out, when we create that timeline, who won what? Well, Gruvix was slain. We know that the war ended because Gruvix was slain in the same era, the same year, that our timeline says the Battle of Carabrix took place for 200 years. That means someone won, and that's the lower tribes. They were united behind this idea of getting revenge on hunting down the slayer of Gruvicos. Interesting. What are the ramifications of that? Is there a hatred for centaurs to this day? How long ago was the Battle of Carabrix? Well, that depends on what your timeline is. If the world is currently set in 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years since the timeline event, is that animosity still there? Did it linger for 400 years? You can let your mind go free and say, right, this is brilliant. Let's add another era to our timeline, because this was a fantastic era. So we go back here. We're going to talk about the unification of the centaurs. Unification. The centaur tribes are unified with the fledgling, with the Utherios Principality. Perhaps that's what they call themselves at that stage. I don't know. Start date, I would say, would be 392. And that unification took 100 years. So by 487, it was done. So we're going to create that era, because it's about building these links. Now we can go in between here and talk about how do we go from the Battle of Carabrix to the unification of the centaurs. It's a great moment. Again, it gives us so many options. Who won what during that unification? The centaurs were brought in. What are the ramifications to the nation and to the kingdoms as a result of that? What do centaurs bring to the table? And quite honestly, they bring two things immediately off of the top of my mind, which when we talk about it, if we go back here, if we go up a slide, I think I can go up a slide. If we go, no, I can't. All right. So logic. Okay. So this happened, caused what? And it caused that to happen, the vacuum of power. Centaurs bring two things. One, they bring an incredible amount of intelligent horsepower. That's something that we often overlook. If you think about it, horses were, for nearly 3,000 years, if not more, the principal means of strength within most kingdoms. It allowed for swift travel. Horses allowed for swift travel. Horses allowed for multiple individuals to be transported quickly from point A to point B. And as you get stronger horses, the Clydesdales and those kinds of horses, they could till fields faster than the general wildlife, oxen and the like. Horses can move faster, they're more agile. Add the centaur component, which is an intelligent humanoid who is capable of creative thought, and suddenly you have a very strong workforce. Maybe I'm being too political here as the governor of the Therios people, but if we can get centaurs into a working class, where if you are a centaur you are not allowed to hold higher office because you can't fit into the senatorial seats, then you are a working class and you are allowed to work and sell your services and make money, but you're not allowed to own land. You're not allowed to do this because we're giving an unfair advantage to the other two-legged bipedal species who can't plow their own fields without having to hire or buy in horses and things. So in order to keep the kingdom stable, we're restricted. All these kinds of wonderful things, the vacuum of power, revenge, all that kind of stuff suddenly allows us to have these amazing ramifications and to unpack that kind of stuff. The other thing that centaurs have is that they're incredibly tall and they have 4 legs. So all of a sudden, if you now have an inclusive kingdom, just look at what we do today in terms of trying to include different members of our society. People who are in wheelchairs need wheelchair access, and rightly so. Why should they be excluded from society because they can't walk up steps? It's a simple change within our society, but it's taken such a long time to do. It really does seem to be a very delayed response to something that should just naturally happen, for example. Imagine now the country goes, well, actually, we also need to provide seating for horses, stabling. Would you call it stabling? Is that politically correct to call it stabling? I'm not sure. All of this from two timeline entries. I think it's amazing. I think it's absolutely wonderful. So if timelines do not get your creative juices flowing, I don't know what. Now, we can always have some fun things that cause all sorts of things to happen. Cataclysms. Cataclysms are a lot of fun, whether it's a volcanic explosion that buries half of the country or most of the country under lava, for example, or whether it is a typhoon or a tsunami or a plague or a fire, it doesn't matter. Cataclysms cause the most tremendous amount of disruption because they usually erase the existing power structures and bring in new power structures. They erase the existing ways of life and bring in new ways of life. They force us to look at things differently. They also allow for amazing things. Volcanic eruptions create incredibly fertile ground, which is why Herculaneum and Pompeii were so close to Vesuvius. The wine that was grown there was amazing because the soil was so fertile because of the mountain and its ejecta that kept the land and the soil replenished with nutrients. The cataclysm that wiped it out changed the approach that we have to a certain degree on how we look at building around volcanoes. And so, yes, that was a major event. Again, if we just go back to our timeline and we have another era here, we can call this one the era of sorrows. And I'm working in big eras here. You can go in and create miniature events within that, of course. So the era of sorrows, the description here is the Great Plague that wiped out more than half of the populations of Eutherios. Okay. And the start date will be, let's say, 531. And the end date, it would last for 10 years, would be more than enough to be destructively terrifying. So 542 would be when it ended. Now we look at this timeline again. The unification of the centaurs happened at 487. 40 years later, so now centaurs are part of society. We've got stabling in the grand senatorial building. Centaurs have the right to stay in accommodation for a less charge than their bipedal fellows because they don't need beds, they just need hay. All those kinds of things have happened. 42 or 43 or 48 years later, suddenly this plague sweeps through. If it doesn't affect centaurs, if it only affects those that live with centaurs, that's interesting. When you look at things like the pox, smallpox, was because we kept chickens indoors during cold winters, and so the European populations built up an immunity to it. It did not devastate our populations, unlike the South American and North American inhabitants when they were first introduced to smallpox. They didn't ever have the need to keep their livestock with them, and so as a result that was deadly for them. Tuberculosis comes from cattle, so if you've now got centaurs living under the same roof, what diseases are they going to be bringing into the population that could evolve over time and then suddenly wipe out the human species or the elvish species or the dwarvish species? Again, there's a vacuum of power that's going to be created, and we should take full advantage of that. Alliances, of course, allow for things to happen, discoveries. A great scientific discovery leads to a breakthrough. If you look at some of our greatest science fiction shows, Star Trek, the discovery of the dilithium that caused a chain reaction between matter and antimatter and could regulate it, and that was a major leap forward. Warp speed was the entire stumbling block, I suppose, for Star Trek Enterprise. Once they got that, that was their big discovery. That was a big milestone in their time period. Mass Effect, the mass drives, the Mass Effect drives were the major discovery. In Star Wars, hyperspace travel was the major discovery. So lots of discoveries have changed and revolutionized things. In the West, the printing press was a major change. I would argue that it was playing cards more than printing press, but the printing press printed those playing cards, so it kind of makes sense. Anyway, the whole idea is that there are so many things that we can draw from to create these amazing, amazing timelines. And we must use them as much as we possibly can, as far as I am concerned, to just unplug those little blocks in our minds that keep us from creating, because there's no reason to either. There is absolutely no reason to either, and we must make sure that that happens. Then finally, we look at timelines and then we ask these questions. What is our expectation from that timeline? What are alternatives that could happen, and what's our favorite moment? So let's go back now to our World Anvil one. This is now presented for us in our layout. And we have these three very simple eras on our timeline. When we can break this down more, and I've done the video on the timeline function of World Anvil, but let's look at the Battle of Carabrix. It was a 200-year-long war. So when we go back to the questions, what's our expectation of the Battle of Carabrix? Massive fields of the dead? Okay, sure. Let's go with massive fields of the dead. So all over our map of Aetherios, we should have battle sites, battlefields that mark, oh, this was the Battle of Carabrix 15. This was the Battle of Carabrix 25. Each battle was given a number rather than given a name to help keep track of all of these battles that lasted for 200 years. Maybe that's a way of doing it. What's an alternative? So let's unpack the Battle of Carabrix. What if we look at it and the Battle of Carabrix, which lasted for 200 years, was mainly fought between groups of 12 to 15 individuals in very short battles where they danced and put on a display to intimidate their opponents. The intimidated opponent would back down after being unable to compete in the singing and dancing ceremonies, and would then pay tribute for a year to the winner. It might sound crazy, but that is a very large degree how the Zulu nation used to fight before King Shaka came in and started adopting a more bloodthirsty approach to battle. So dance sequences might not be crazy, and it is certainly an alternative, which, well, if that's the case, then are those dances perpetuated? Have they carried on? Look at the Maoris, they're known as the All Blacks in the rugby circles. They do their wonderful haka, which is known to inspire fear. That came from a dance, that came from their historical background. Their timeline inspired that, and it's still used today. And then what's your favorite moment? So if we go back to this timeline, I have to look at this and say, I think my favorite moment here is the unification of the centaurs. I like the Battle of Carabrix and I like the Era of Sorrows, but the unification of the centaurs to me really got me going on tangents, making this video so much longer than it needed to be. But do you see what that does, though? It unlocked this torrent of stuff. There are now so many quests that could go on. Where is the first centaur seat? Where is the first centaur saddle that was burned when centaurs were no longer seen as livestock but now suddenly had rights? Where is the first arrow that was fired by the first bounty hunter of the centaurs? Where's the last arrow? So many quests and missions and adventures and legends and myths come out of this. The great centaur liberator, a warrior who had no name, moved in the shadows, but his body was that of the piebald. It had wonderful patches of different tans and whites, which allowed him to disappear into the forests as he rescued young centaur where's the word gone? Fillies and colts and younglings from the evil oppressor, and was eventually caught and hung, drawn, and eighth. Because you can't quarter a horse, man. You have to eighth them. Anyway, so yes, it could create all kinds of amazing things that you shouldn't underestimate. And it's just by jotting down some random timeline events and then just seeing what comes out of them. I think there's nothing more entertaining than spending an afternoon creating a timeline. I don't know why I'm skipping through all of these. Creating a timeline and just having some fun. It really does instill, I think anyway, a remarkable opportunity for you to create some very unique and very lifelike events. Until next time, however, I hope you and yours have a lot of fun creating timelines of your own. And until next time, light up the forge.